March 17, 1837. Dun Laoghaire Harbor, County Dublin, Ireland. When dock worker Thomas Brennan's body washed ashore on St. Patrick's Day morning, the coroner noted something peculiar in his official report. The man's hands were still clenched in fists. His face, frozen in an expression witnesses described as absolute terror, showed no signs of drowning. But it was the state of his clothing that disturbed investigators most, torn to ribbons as if by impossibly strong hands, or claws. Exactly 48 hours earlier, Brennan had shot a seal at these very docks, a large gray seal that local fishermen swore had been watching the harbor for weeks, the same seal that Brennan's pregnant wife Catherine had been leaving fish for every evening, whispering to it in Irish Gaelic, calling it a chara, my friend. The morning after Brennan killed the seal, Catherine walked into Dublin Bay, 5 months pregnant, fully clothed, in front of 7 witnesses who said she moved as if called. The local magistrate closed both cases as accidental deaths within a week. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in Victorian Dublin dared to admit. Before we uncover the truth about the Dun Laoghaire Harbor seal and the deaths that followed, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We're diving deep into one of Ireland's most suppressed historical mysteries, a story that bridges ancient folklore and documented Victorian tragedy. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's step back into 1837, to a harbor town caught between the old world and the new. The year 1837 marked a pivotal moment in Irish history. Queen Victoria had just ascended to the British throne in June, ushering in an era that would define the century. But in Ireland, the scars of colonization ran deep. The country was still reeling from the tithe war of the early 1830s, where Irish Catholics were forced to pay taxes to the Protestant Church of Ireland. Resentment simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. Dun Laoghaire, then called Kingstown, renamed in 1821 to honor King George IV's visit, was a town of contradictions. Its magnificent harbor, completed in 1842 after decades of construction, represented British engineering prowess and control over Irish waters. The east and west piers stretched into the Irish Sea like arms claiming dominion over the waves. Yet this was also a place where ancient Irish traditions persisted in whispers, in the Gaelic spoken in back-alley pubs, in the stories grandmothers told children when the Protestant ministers weren't listening. The harbor employed hundreds of men. Dock workers, fishermen, merchants, and sailors created a rough working-class community that existed in the shadow of Dublin's Anglo-Irish elite. These were men who worked with their hands, who knew the sea's temperament, who understood that the waters off Ireland's coast held mysteries older than any church. Thomas Brennan was one of these men. 34 years old in 1837, he'd worked the Kingstown docks for nearly 15 years. Parish records describe him as a man of sound Protestant faith and steady employment. He married Catherine O'Malley in 1833, a union that raised eyebrows among his colleagues. Catherine came from Connemara, from the wild western coast where Irish was still the first language, and the old beliefs ran deeper than Christianity. Their marriage, by all accounts, was difficult. Thomas's supervisor, William Hartford, noted in his personal diary, preserved now in the Dublin City archives, that Brennan complained often of his wife's peculiar habits and her stubborn adherence to papist superstitions. Catherine didn't attend Protestant services. She spoke Irish at home. She walked the harbor at twilight, staring at the water for hours. The seal appeared in January 1837. Harbor master records from that month note unusual S.E.L. activity near the East Pier. But this wasn't just any seal. Multiple witnesses described a large gray seal, easily 7 feet long, that seemed to frequent the harbor with unnatural regularity. Unlike typical seals, which avoided the busy commercial areas, this one appeared at the same time each day, just before sunset. Fisherman Patrick Delaney recorded in a letter to his brother, dated February 3, 1837, "There's a great seal come to the harbor, brother. The lads say it watches us. Watches like it's thinking. Old Mrs. Flaherty from the fish market crossed herself when she saw it, and said a prayer in the old tongue. She wouldn't say what spooked her so, but I seen her face. She was afraid." Catherine Brennan began visiting the seal within days of its first appearance. Multiple dock workers reported seeing her on the East Pier in the evenings, standing at the edge with a basket. She would place fish on the stone pier, then step back. The seal would emerge from the water, not cautiously as wild animals do, but deliberately, and take the fish. Then witnesses reported, Catherine would speak to it. She talked to it like a person, dock worker James Murphy testified later to the magistrate. In Irish, so I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was familiar, like she was talking to someone she knew. And God help me, sometimes it seemed like the seal understood. Thomas Brennan's colleagues began to mock him. In the masculine world of the Victorian docks, a man who couldn't control his wife was no man at all. The teasing started as jokes but grew sharper. His wife was mad, they said. She was probably cuckolding him with some Irishman from the Catholic neighborhoods. She was making him look foolish. The pressure built through February. Thomas began drinking more heavily. Hartford's diary entries from this period describe Brennan as increasingly agitated and short-tempered. His work suffers. He speaks of his wife with contempt and rage. Something else was happening too. Something the official records barely mention but that survives in personal letters and diary entries from the period. Catherine was pregnant. She'd conceived in October 1836, making her about 4 months along by February 1837, but she'd told almost no one, certainly not the Protestant community that Thomas belonged to. She'd confided only in Mary Flaherty, an elderly Irish woman who sold fish at the harbor market. Mrs. Flaherty's testimony given to the magistrate after the deaths includes this chilling detail. Catherine came to me in January, just after the seal arrived. She was with child, she said, but she was frightened. She'd had dreams, dark dreams of drowning and blood in the water. She asked me if I knew the old stories about the Selkie'S. I told her I did, but that they were just stories. She said, "Not all stories are lies, Mary, some are warnings." The old stories, the Selkie legends. In Irish and Scottish folklore, Selkies are seals that can shed their skins and become human. The legends carry a dark warning: harm a Selkie, and the sea itself will take revenge. The stories speak of fishermen who killed seals only to find their boats destroyed in calm waters, of villages that slaughtered seal colonies and then lost their children to mysterious drownings, of women who befriended Selkies and were called into the ocean, never to return. Superstition, the Protestant establishment would say. Primitive Irish nonsense. But in Catherine's mind, raised on these stories, fed on the old beliefs, something was stirring. The seal that came every day, the dreams of drowning, the child growing in her womb. They were all connected somehow. By early March 1837, the tension in the Brennan household had reached a breaking point. Thomas had forbidden Catherine from going to the harbor. She went anyway. He'd thrown away the fish she'd saved for the seal. She bought more. On March 14th, Thomas Brennan made a decision. He would kill the seal. The first incident occurred on March 10th, 1837. Catherine Brennan collapsed during market day in Kingstown. Several witnesses saw it happen in the town square near George's Street. She'd been walking normally one moment, then suddenly stopped, went rigid, and fell to the cobblestones. Mary Flaherty rushed to her side. She was awake but not seeing, Mrs. Flaherty testified later. Her eyes were open, fixed on something I couldn't see. She was whispering in Irish. I leaned close to hear. She kept saying, "Tasaag teached. He is coming." Over and over, Tasaag teached. When Catherine came back to herself, she had no memory of the episode. But she begged Mrs. Flaherty not to tell Thomas. "He'll think I'm mad," she said. "He's already convinced I am." That same evening, the seal appeared at the harbor pier at its usual time, but its behavior had changed. Multiple witnesses reported that the seal was more aggressive, more agitated. It swam in circles near the pier, occasionally breaching the water and making sounds described as almost human in their distress. When Catherine arrived with her basket of fish, the seal refused to take food. Instead, it stared at her. Dock worker Michael O'Brien, who watched the scene from a nearby warehouse, later wrote to his sister, "I've worked these docks 20 years and never seen a seal behave so." It looked at her like it was trying to tell her something. Mrs. Brennan was crying. She was saying something to it in Irish, and I swear on my mother's grave, the seal responded. It made sounds I've never heard a seal make, almost like words. The second incident came 2 days later on March 12th. Thomas Brennan confronted his wife in their home on Marine Road. Neighbors reported hearing shouting. The walls of these worker housing units were thin. Privacy was a luxury no one in Kingstown's working class enjoyed. Margaret Walsh, who lived in the adjacent unit, gave this statement to authorities. Mr. Brennan was screaming about the seal. He called his wife terrible names, said she was making him a laughingstock, said the men at the docks were laughing at him because his wife preferred a fish to her own husband. Mrs. Brennan was crying, begging him to leave the seal alone. She kept saying, "It's not what you think. Please, Thomas, please don't harm it." The argument ended with the sound of something breaking, furniture, witnesses thought, and then silence. The next morning, Catherine appeared at Mary Flaherty's fish stall with a bruise on her face. I asked her what happened, Mrs. Flaherty testified. She wouldn't say at first, but then she grabbed my hand hard and said, "He's going to kill it, Mary. He's going to kill the seal, and when he does, something terrible will happen. I know it. I've seen it in my dreams." I told her it was just a seal, just an animal, but she looked at me with such fear in her eyes and said, "No, it's not." The third incident happened that very night. At approximately 11 p.m. on March 12th, multiple residents near the harbor reported hearing sounds from the water. Not the normal sounds of waves and wind, but something else. Something that several witnesses described independently as singing. Constable Robert Patterson, who was making his rounds near the East Pier, included this in his official report. "I heard what I initially took to be a woman singing. The sound came from the direction of the harbor. Upon investigation, I found the water was quite still, but the sound continued. It was not English. It may have been Irish, though I do not speak that language. The melody was haunting and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. I found no person near the water. After approximately 10 minutes, the sound ceased." The next morning, fishermen reported that their nets, left in the harbor overnight, had been torn to pieces, not cut, torn, as if by something with tremendous strength. "Every boat in the harbor," fisherman Patrick Delaney wrote in his diary. "Every single net destroyed. Never seen anything like it. The lads are saying it was sharks, but there's no sharks in these waters this time of year. And sharks don't tear nets like that. All in the same pattern, all in the same place. Like something did it on purpose." The fourth and final incident before the shooting occurred on March 14th, the day Thomas Brennan made his fatal decision. Catherine went to the harbor in the late afternoon, earlier than usual. She'd left her home without telling Thomas. Mary Flaherty saw her on the pier and later described her state. She looked wild. Her hair was undone. She wasn't wearing a coat, though it was cold. She was carrying something in her arms wrapped in cloth. What Catherine carried was a gray woolen blanket, her own baby blanket, according to Mrs. Flaherty, brought from Connemara when she married. Catherine knelt at the edge of the pier. The seal appeared immediately, as if it had been waiting. What happened next was witnessed by at least 6 people, all of whom gave similar testimonies. Catherine placed the blanket on the stones and spoke to the seal in Irish. Her voice carried across the water in the evening stillness. Then she did something that made the witnesses freeze. She began to sing. The same melody that Constable Patterson had heard 2 nights before, the same haunting air that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And the seal responded. It raised itself partially out of the water and made sounds that several witnesses insisted sounded like harmony, like it was singing with her. James Murphy was close enough to hear some of Catherine's words. Though he didn't speak Irish fluently, he recognized a few phrases. In his statement, he recalled, "She said something like Mo Gra, my love, I think that means. And to Bron Orm, I'm sorry." She was apologizing to the seal, crying and apologizing. The seal approached the pier closer than it had ever come. Catherine reached out her hand. The seal, according to every witness, pressed its head against her palm. They stayed like that for several minutes, woman and seal, connected in a moment that defied rational explanation. Then Catherine stood, gathered the blanket, and walked away without looking back. The seal watched her go, then disappeared beneath the water. That evening, Thomas Brennan told his supervisor, William Hartford, that he was going to handle the situation with my wife. Hartford would later testify that Brennan had been drinking and seemed determined to reclaim his dignity through whatever means necessary. What Thomas Brennan meant was this: he was going to kill the thing that had stolen his wife's affection and his colleagues' respect. He was going to shoot the seal. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries rooted in real history. Let's discover what happens next, because what occurred on March 15th would shock even the hardened investigators of Victorian Dublin. March 15th, 1837, 4:47 a.m. Thomas Brennan arrived at the East Pier before dawn. He carried his supervisor's rifle, borrowed under the pretense of shooting rats in the warehouse district. The harbor was deserted at this hour, wrapped in the gray mist that rolls off the Irish Sea before sunrise. Dock worker Patrick Delaney, arriving early to prepare his fishing boat, saw Brennan on the pier. He testified. Mr. Brennan was standing at the edge, staring at the water. He had a rifle. I asked him what he was doing, and he said, waiting for my wife's lover. I thought he'd gone mad. I asked if he meant to shoot a man, and he laughed. Said, not a man, something worse. Delaney left, disturbed but not wanting to involve himself in another man's marital troubles. This was the Victorian era, A husband's authority in his household was absolute. Whatever Thomas Brennan planned to do was, legally and socially, his own business. The seal appeared at 5:23 a.m., just as the first light broke over. Dublin Bay. 3 witnesses, 2 fishermen and a harbor clerk arriving for the morning shift, saw what happened next. The seal surfaced near the pier, in the exact spot where Catherine fed it every evening. It seemed to be looking for her. When it saw Thomas Brennan instead, armed and waiting, the seal didn't flee. According to all 3 witnesses, it moved closer. It swam right up to the pier, testified harbor clerk Edward Morris, like it recognized Mr. Brennan, like it was curious, or maybe it thought he was bringing food. It raised its head out of the water not 3 feet from where he stood. Thomas Brennan raised the rifle. I heard him say something, Morris continued in his statement. He said, "This is what becomes of those who make a fool of Thomas Brennan." Then he fired. The shot echoed across the harbor. The seal jerked in the water, blood blooming dark in the dawn light. But it didn't die immediately. This is where the testimonies become disturbing, where the rational veneer of Victorian record-keeping cracks to reveal something underneath that the authorities tried desperately to explain away. All 3 witnesses reported the same phenomenon. As the seal died, it made sounds, not the barking or grunting that seals typically make. Sounds that seemed almost like words, almost like screaming. "It was the most awful thing I've ever heard," fisherman John Brennan, no relation to Thomas's, testified. "The creature was crying out and it sounded human. I know how mad that sounds. But I wasn't the only one who heard it. We all did. It sounded like a woman screaming." The seal thrashed in the water for nearly a minute, its blood spreading across the surface of the harbor. Thomas Brennan stood frozen on the pier, the rifle still raised. Then the seal went still. It floated for a moment, then began to sink. But before it disappeared beneath the surface, Edward Morris noticed something that he included in his official report, despite knowing how it would sound. The seal's eyes in those final moments were looking directly at Mr. Brennan. "I have seen many animals die. I have seen the blank emptiness that enters their eyes as life departs. This was not that. The seal's eyes held something, recognition, or perhaps condemnation. It is difficult to articulate, but in that moment I felt a profound sense of dread." Thomas Brennan left the pier without speaking to anyone. He returned the rifle to the warehouse where it belonged, went home to his wife, and, according to what Catherine later told Mary Flaherty, crawled into bed without saying a word. Catherine woke to find him beside her, staring at the ceiling, his hands shaking. "What have you done?" she asked him. "What needed doing?" he replied. Catherine got out of bed. She dressed in silence. Then she told her husband, "You've killed us both." Thomas thought she was being hysterical. He told her to stop her nonsense and make breakfast. Instead, Catherine left the house. Mary Flaherty's fish stall opened at 6 a.m. She testified that Catherine arrived in a state of complete distress, shaking and weeping. When Mrs. Flaherty asked what was wrong, Catherine could barely speak through her tears. "He killed it," she managed to say. "Thomas shot the seal, the Selkie. He shot him, Mary, he shot him, and now the sea will come for payment." Mrs. Flaherty tried to calm her, to reason with her. "It was just a seal, dear, just an animal. Your husband was wrong to kill it, but it won't." Catherine grabbed the older woman's arms with startling strength. "You don't understand. It wasn't just a seal. I knew him, Mary. I knew him. He came back to find me. After all these years, he came back. And Thomas killed him. The sea doesn't forgive. The sea always takes payment." Mrs. Flaherty would spend the rest of her life haunted by what Catherine said next, by words she didn't understand until it was too late. "I have to go to him," Catherine whispered. "He's calling me. I can hear him under the water. He's calling my name." Mrs. Flaherty tried to keep Catherine at her stall, even physically restrained her. But Catherine pulled away with surprising force and ran toward the harbor. It was 6:34 a.m. on March 15, 1837. 7 witnesses saw Catherine Brennan walk down the East Pier. She moved with purpose, with an odd grace that several people described as dreamlike or entranced. She wore only her nightdress and a shawl. Her feet were bare. She walked the entire length of the pier, over 400 feet, without hesitation, without stopping. Harbor Master Daniel O'Connell saw her from his office window. He testified, "I knew immediately something was wrong. I ran from my office shouting for her to stop, but she didn't seem to hear me. She walked as if compelled by some force beyond her control. When Catherine reached the end of the pier, she stopped. For a moment she simply stood there staring at the water. The sun had risen fully now. It was a clear morning. The sea was calm. Then Catherine began to sing. The same melody she'd sung to the seal the day before, the same haunting air that Constable Patterson had heard coming from the harbor. And from the water, according to the 7 witnesses, came an answering sound. "I heard it plain as I hear my own voice now," testified fisherman Michael O'Brien. Something in the water singing back to her. The same melody. We all looked, but we couldn't see anything. Just the water, but the sound was there. God help me, it was there. Catherine spread her arms wide. She looked peaceful, O'Brien continued, like she'd made a decision and was at peace with it. Then she spoke, loud enough for us to hear. She said in English this time, "I'm coming," and she stepped off the pier. Multiple witnesses ran to help. O'Connell dove into the water after her. But Catherine Brennan didn't fight. She didn't struggle. She sank like a stone, her arms still spread wide, her face turned upward toward the surface. "When I reached her, she was already deep," O'Connell testified, his voice breaking. "I grabbed for her, got hold of her dress. But she looked at me, and her eyes, they were calm, almost happy. She mouthed something. I couldn't hear it underwater, but I could read her lips. She said, 'Tell him I forgive him.' Then she pulled away from me, deeper, and I couldn't reach her, I couldn't save her. Catherine's body was recovered an hour later by fishermen using nets. She was found at the bottom of the harbor, in approximately 30 feet of water, directly below where the seal had been shot. The coroner's examination revealed several disturbing facts. Catherine Brennan was 5 months pregnant, carrying a healthy male child. There was no water in her lungs. Despite being found at the bottom of the harbor, Catherine had not drowned. Her heart had simply stopped. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure brought on by distress and possible melancholia. Hat had bewitched her. No one believed him. Most thought he was mad with grief. Some thought he was trying to justify his wife's suicide. A few whispered that Thomas had driven Catherine to her death with his jealousy and violence. March 16th dawned with strange reports from the harbor. Fishermen who went out that morning reported unusual seal activity. At least 20 seals had gathered near the East Pier, an unprecedented number. They swam in circles where Catherine had died. The official reports were filed with the causes of death as accidental in both cases. The investigation was closed within a week, but the people of Kingstown knew. The dock workers knew. The fishermen knew. Thomas Brennan had killed something he shouldn't have. The sea had taken payment. And Catherine, whether by choice or compulsion, had answered a call that transcended death itself. The seals never returned to Dun Laoghaire Harbor in such numbers again. But for years afterward, fishermen reported occasional sightings of a large gray seal near the East Pier, always at sunset, always in the exact spot where Catherine used to feed the seals. And sometimes, on still evenings when the water was calm, people claimed they could hear singing drifting across the harbor. A woman's voice and something deeper, harmonizing in an ancient melody that predated Christianity, predated English rule, predated everything except the sea itself. The official investigation into the deaths of Catherine and Thomas Brennan lasted exactly 6 days. For the British authorities governing Ireland in 1837, this case presented a problem that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with control. Magistrate Sir Charles Worthington, who oversaw the investigation, made his priorities clear in a private letter to the Dublin Castle administration discovered in government archives in 1923. The Irish population is already disposed towards superstition and Catholic mysticism. To allow speculation about supernatural causes in an official investigation would only embolden their primitive beliefs and undermine British authority. The deaths, while tragic, must be explained through rational means. The investigation focused on 3 theories, each designed to avoid any mention of the seal, the Selkie folklore, or the disturbing circumstances surrounding both deaths. Initially, authorities considered whether Thomas had murdered Catherine and then killed himself in guilt. This theory was supported by evidence of domestic violence, Catherine's facial bruising, witness testimony about arguments, and Thomas's volatile behavior in the days before her death. However, this theory collapsed quickly. Too many witnesses had seen Catherine walk into the water of her own accord. Too many people had seen Thomas at the pub, drunk but alive, hours before his body was found. The timeline didn't support murder. Victorian medicine had a convenient diagnosis for any woman whose behavior couldn't be controlled: hysteria. The coroner suggested that Catherine's pregnancy had caused temporary insanity, leading to her suicide. Thomas, overcome with grief and guilt, had then followed his wife into death either through accident or intention. This became the semi-official explanation. It was tidy. It blamed mental illness, specifically female mental illness, and avoided uncomfortable questions about seals, folklore, or anything that couldn't be explained by British medical science. The Protestant community of Kingstown largely accepted this version. It allowed them to pity the Brennans while maintaining their superiority over Irish superstition. The final official ruling classified both deaths as accidental. Catherine had fallen into the harbor while in a disturbed mental state. Thomas had drowned while intoxicated. The physical evidence that contradicted this, the lack of water in their lungs, the seal fur, the scratches on Thomas's body, the terror frozen on his face, was either explained away or quietly omitted from final reports. Constable Patterson attempted to include his observations about the seal fur and the scratches in the official record. Magistrate Worthington struck them from the final report. In Patterson's personal diary he wrote, "I am told that facts which do not fit the preferred narrative are not facts at all but confusion. I am told that the scratches on Mr. Brennan's body are from rocks that do not exist in that part of the harbor. I am told that the fur found in both victims' hands was likely debris from fishing nets, despite looking nothing like such material. I am told many things. I believe none of them." But what about the Irish community? What did they believe? Mary Flaherty, Catherine's confidant, refused to accept the official explanation. In testimony that was excluded from the final report, she stated, "Catherine knew what was coming. She told me the seal wasn't just a seal. She told me it was a Selkie, come back to find her. She said she'd known him before, in her life in Connemara. I don't pretend to understand it all, but I know this. Catherine went to that water because she was called. And Thomas died because he killed something sacred." The Irish dock workers and fishermen developed their own understanding of events. Within weeks of the deaths, a narrative had formed in the Gaelic-speaking community. A narrative that the British authorities either couldn't understand or chose to ignore. According to this version, preserved in Irish language accounts and oral histories, Catherine O'Malley had been beloved by a Selkie in her youth in Connemara. When she married Thomas and moved to Kingstown, the Selkie had searched for her for years. The seal that appeared in January 1837 was the Selkie, finally finding his lost love. Thomas, blinded by jealousy and colonial arrogance, had killed the Selkie. The sea, which in Irish mythology is not just a physical entity but a living force with its own justice, demanded payment. Catherine was called to join her true love in death. Thomas was dragged down by the Selkie's vengeance. This version was never written in official English records, but it survived in Irish songs, in stories told in pubs and homes where English wasn't spoken, in the collective memory of a colonized people who understood that some truths exist outside the narratives of their oppressors. The legal aftermath was brief. No charges were filed. No one was held responsible. The deaths were ruled accidental, the case was closed, and Magistrate Worthington moved on to other matters. But there were consequences that rippled through Kingstown in ways the authorities hadn't anticipated. Harbor workers began refusing to work near the East Pier at dawn or dusk, the times when the seal had appeared, when Catherine had fed it, when both deaths had occurred. Fishermen avoided the spot where Catherine's body had been found, claiming their nets tangled mysteriously in that location. William Hartford, Thomas's supervisor, noted in his diary that productivity at the docks declined significantly in the months following the deaths. "The men are spooked," he wrote. "They see omens in every seal that passes through the harbor. They cross themselves and mutter in Irish when they think I'm not listening." The house where Thomas and Catherine had lived on Marine Road remained empty for 3 years. No one would rent it. Neighbors reported hearing singing from inside the empty rooms at night, Catherine's voice, they said, still calling for her lost love. Eventually, the house was demolished. The Brennan case did lead to one small change in British policy. In 1838, the Dublin Constabulary issued guidelines about investigating deaths in the Irish community. These guidelines, buried in administrative documents, essentially instructed authorities to pay closer attention to native superstitions and beliefs when investigating unusual deaths, not because they gave these beliefs credence, but because ignoring them led to civil unrest and loss of productivity among the Irish working class. In other words, let them believe their fairy tales, but keep it from disrupting British business. Several people connected to the case suffered afterwards. Mary Flaherty, who had tried to protect Catherine, became increasingly obsessed with Selkie folklore. She collected stories, interviewed elderly Irish speakers about the old beliefs, and maintained until her death in 1852 that Catherine had been telling the truth. Her family considered her slightly mad. Edward Morris, the harbor clerk who found Thomas's body, requested a transfer to a different post within 6 months. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen, but his daughter found a letter among his effects after his death. In it, Morris wrote, "There are things in this world that our science cannot explain, and our religion will not acknowledge. I have seen such a thing. I have seen evidence of a force beyond human understanding, and I have seen what happens when arrogant men dismiss what they cannot comprehend. Constable Patterson continued his duties but became increasingly critical of how British authorities handled investigations in Irish communities. He was eventually demoted for excessive sympathy with native populations and finished his career as a simple watchman. Magistrate Worthington's career conversely flourished. His handling of the Brennan case, quickly resolved, no scandal, no uncomfortable questions, was seen as exemplary. He was promoted to a higher court in Dublin within 2 years, but there's a postscript to his story, found in the records of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. In 1849, 12 years after the Brennan deaths, Worthington made a substantial anonymous donation to have masses said for 2 souls lost to the sea, that they might find peace. The donation was recorded as anonymous, but the cathedral's financial records identified Worthington as the donor. Was it guilt? Or had something happened in those 12 years to make the rational magistrate reconsider what he'd dismissed as Irish superstition? We'll never know. Worthington died in 1851, taking his private thoughts to the grave. The broader Catholic and Irish nationalist community seized on the Brennan case as an example of British injustice and cultural suppression. While they didn't necessarily believe in Selkie'S, they recognized the symbolic power of the story. An Irish woman, married to a man of the Protestant establishment, maintained her connection to her culture and beliefs. Her husband, representing British colonial authority, tried to destroy what he didn't understand. Both paid the ultimate price. In the 1840s, as Ireland descended into the Great Famine and tensions between Irish Catholics and British Protestants reached new heights, the story of Catherine and the Seal became a metaphor. Irish writers and poets referenced it in veiled terms. Songs were written in Irish that told the story without naming names. By the 1850s, the actual events had been absorbed into Irish folklore. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes Catherine was a princess, sometimes the Seal was explicitly magical. Sometimes Thomas was a British soldier instead of a dock worker. But the core remained, a woman called by the sea. A man who killed what he couldn't control. Death as the price of colonial arrogance. One version, collected by folklorist Jeremiah Curtin in his 1890 work Myths and Folklore of Ireland, tells the story without any names or specific locations. But the parallels are clear. In the old days, there was a woman who loved a seal man. Her husband, who did not believe in such things, killed the seal. The sea rose up in fury and took them both, the woman to be with her love beneath the waves, the husband to be punished for his crime against the old ways. The Dun Laoghaire Harbor case, while officially closed and largely forgotten by British authorities, left ripples that extended far beyond 2 tragic deaths in 1837. At its heart, this case represents a clash between colonizer and colonized worldviews. British Victorian society, with its emphasis on rationality, scientific progress, and Protestant Christianity, had no framework for understanding or respecting Irish folklore traditions. To acknowledge that Catherine's beliefs about Selkie'S had any validity, even cultural or psychological validity, would have meant admitting that Irish culture held truths that British culture could. Explain, this was intolerable to the colonial mindset. Historian Dr. Siobhan Murphy, in her 2003 work Folklore and Resistance in 19th Century Ireland, argues that cases like the Brennan deaths were flashpoints in a larger cultural war. The British didn't just want to control Irish land and labor. They wanted to control Irish minds. Every time an Irishman or woman maintained belief in the old ways, in Selkie'S, fairies, banshees, or any of the supernatural entities that predated Christianity, they were committing an act of cultural resistance. The Brennan case demonstrates this resistance. Catherine, despite marrying into the Protestant establishment, despite living in an anglicized harbor town, despite every pressure to assimilate, maintained her beliefs. She spoke Irish. She honored the old traditions. She believed in Selkie'S. And for that, the official narrative had to label her mad. Catherine's warnings were dismissed. Her fears were labeled hysteria. Her spiritual beliefs were pathologized as mental illness. This was standard Victorian practice when dealing with women who didn't conform to expected behavior. The coroner's conclusion, that pregnancy had driven Catherine to temporary insanity, reflected common medical beliefs of the era. Women were considered fundamentally unstable, their bodies and minds subject to irrational forces that men, through superior rationality, had to control. What if Catherine had been believed? What if someone had taken her seriously when she said the seal was important, that killing it would have consequences, that she felt called to the water? Would it have changed anything? Probably not. In 1837, a woman's testimony, especially an Irish Catholic woman married to a Protestant man, carried almost no weight. Her beliefs were primitive, superstition. His authority was law. but the case raises uncomfortable questions about how many other women in Victorian society experienced genuine spiritual or cultural crises that were dismissed as madness. How many Catherine Brennans were there, trying to maintain connections to their traditions in a world that demanded they abandon them? Despite British efforts to suppress and ridicule Irish folklore, the Selkie legends survived. They survived in the Brennan case, they survived in oral traditions, and they survive today. Why? Because folklore serves purposes that rational, scientific worldviews often cannot. Folklore provides meaning. It provides explanation for the inexplicable. It provides a framework for understanding tragedy, loss, and the wild forces of nature that remain beyond human control. When Catherine drowned, the scientific explanation, temporary insanity brought on by pregnancy, provided no comfort, no meaning, no justice. But the folklore explanation, that she was called by her Selkie love, that she chose to join him rather than live without him, that the sea claimed Thomas for his crime against something sacred, provided all three. The folklore version isn't true in the empirical sense, but it's true in the way that myths and legends are true. It captures something essential about human experience, about love and loss, about the price of destroying what we don't understand. The Brennan case wasn't unique. Throughout the 19th century, in Ireland, Scotland, and other Celtic regions, there are documented cases of people dying in ways that locals attributed to violations of folklore rules. In 1842, in the Orkney Islands of Scotland, a fisherman named Robert Scarth killed a seal that his wife had been feeding. 3 days later, Scarth drowned in calm waters within sight of shore. His wife disappeared the same night and was never found. The official cause was listed as accidental drowning for both, but local belief held that the wife had been a Selkie herself and returned to the sea after her husband's crime. In 1856, in County Kerry, Ireland, a farmer named Michael O'Shea destroyed a fairy fort on his land despite warnings from neighbors. Within a month, 3 of his children died of mysterious illnesses. The doctor attributed it to typhoid, but the community knew better. O'Shea went mad with grief and died in an asylum, claiming he could hear the fairies singing outside his window every night. Pattern emerges. Someone violates a folklore rule. Tragedy follows. Officials provide rational explanations. The local community maintains the supernatural interpretation. These cases reveal the dual reality of 19th century Celtic communities under British rule. There was the official reality of coroner's reports, magistrate rulings, and scientific explanations, and there was the unofficial reality of folklore beliefs, traditional knowledge, and spiritual understandings that persisted despite, or perhaps because of, official suppression. The sea holds a special place in Irish and Celtic mythology. It's not just water. It's a liminal space, a boundary between worlds. It's where Selkie'S live, where the souls of the dead journey, where human rules don't apply. In Irish tradition, the sea is both provider and destroyer. It gives life through fishing and trade, but it demands respect. It has its own laws, its own justice, its own creatures that must not be harmed. Catherine's connection to the sea, through her belief in the Selkie, through her calling to the water, through her death by drowning, places her firmly in this mythological tradition. She becomes, in the folklore version of events, a bridge between the human world and the sea world. She honored the old ways. The sea honored her in return by calling her home. Thomas, conversely, represents the colonial violation of natural law. He killed for pride, for control, for authority. The sea responded with its own authority, older, deeper, more absolute than any British magistrate. While the Brennan case didn't lead to major legal reforms, it did contribute to a growing awareness that British authorities needed better strategies for managing native superstitions in Ireland. By the 1840s, as Ireland faced the Great Famine and political tensions escalated, the British government began to recognize that completely dismissing Irish culture and beliefs was counterproductive. It bred resentment, resistance, and sometimes outright rebellion. New guidelines for colonial administrators emphasized the importance of cultural sensitivity, not because the British suddenly respected Irish traditions, but because ignoring them led to instability. This was pure pragmatism. Let the Irish believe in their fairies and Selkie'S, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't revolt. Suppress the beliefs only when they threatened British authority or economic interests. The Brennan case became a cautionary tale within colonial administrative circles. Dismiss local beliefs at your peril, not because they're true, but because the people who hold them will judge you by their standards, not yours. Modern Dun Laoghaire has largely forgotten the Brennan case. The harbor is now a bustling modern port and ferry terminal. The East Pier is a popular walking destination for tourists and locals alike. But traces remain. In the 1920s, when Ireland gained independence and Kingstown was renamed Dun Laoghaire, there was a brief movement to create a memorial to Thomas Brennan. Local Irish language advocates wanted to honor her as a symbol of cultural resistance, a woman who maintained her beliefs despite pressure to assimilate. The memorial was never built, but a small plaque placed by the Dun Laoghaire Historical Society in 1987 marks the general area where Catherine died. It reads simply, "In memory of those lost to the sea, may they find peace in the deep." Some locals know the story behind the plaque, others walk past it every day without a second thought. And the seals, they still come to Dun Laoghaire Harbor. Not in the numbers reported in March 1837, but regularly enough. They surface near the piers, especially at dawn and dusk. They watch the humans with their dark, intelligent eyes. Some people feed them, despite signs saying not to. Some people talk to them, though they'd never admit it to their rational modern friends. And sometimes, on very still evenings when the harbor is quiet and the sun is setting, people claim they hear singing drifting across the water. A woman's voice and something deeper, harmonizing in a melody that predates everything except the sea itself. Ultimately, the Dun Laoghaire Harbor case reveals something fundamental about how humans navigate between belief and rationality, between tradition and modernity, between the world we can explain and the world that defies explanation. Catherine believed. Her belief gave her comfort, connection, and meaning. It also led her to walk into the sea. Thomas didn't believe. His rational skepticism gave him authority and control. It also led him to kill something he shouldn't have, if the folklore is true. It led to his own death in the same waters. The British authorities believed only in what they could measure and control. Their rational worldview allowed them to build an empire. But it also made them blind to truths that existed outside their framework. The Irish community believed in both worlds, the rational and the mythological. This dual belief allowed them to survive under colonialism while maintaining their cultural identity. But it also meant living with ambiguity, with truths that couldn't be proven, with mysteries that had no satisfying resolution. Who was right? Who held the truth? Maybe the question itself is wrong. Maybe truth isn't singular. Maybe different truths can coexist. Scientific truth and mythological truth, rational truth and spiritual truth, colonial truth and indigenous truth. Or maybe, just maybe, there are some things in this world that rationality cannot explain. Some forces older than science. Some debts that must be paid. Some calls that cannot be refused. On March 15, 1837, Catherine Brennan walked into Dublin Bay. 2 days later, her husband followed. The official explanation is temporary insanity and accidental drowning. But in the old stories told in Irish around peat fires on winter nights, the truth is different. The truth is about a woman who loved a Selkie, a man who killed what he couldn't control, and the sea, which always takes payment for debts unpaid. Which truth do you believe? The story of Catherine and Thomas Brennan raises questions that transcend the specific events of March 1837. What drove Thomas to kill the seal? Was it truly about reclaiming his authority, or was there something deeper, something he sensed but couldn't articulate, that made the seal a threat he had to eliminate? And Catherine, did she walk into the water by choice, answering a call she truly heard? Or was her death the tragic result of isolation, domestic violence, and a society that gave her no other option? Leave your theories in the comments. Do you think there was something supernatural at work in Dun Laoghaire Harbor, or can everything be explained by the psychological and social pressures of the time? What would you have done if you'd been Constable Patterson, knowing the official explanation didn't match the evidence? This case sits at the intersection of history and folklore, where documented facts blend with cultural beliefs to create something that resists easy categorization. It reminds us that the past is never as clear-cut as we'd like to believe, and that sometimes the most interesting truths are the ones that official records tried hardest to suppress. If you found this deep dive into Victorian Ireland's darkest secret fascinating, subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history that challenge everything we think we know. Hit that notification bell. Our next investigation explores an 1845 case from Cornwall, where an entire fishing village disappeared overnight, leaving only a single word carved into every door: forgiven. Share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that blur the line between history and legend. Our community of truth seekers is growing, and we love hearing your perspectives on these forgotten cases. The sea remembers what we choose to forget. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never accept the easy answers. See you in the next video.